They look like random shapes, perhaps a kaleidoscope or even odd puzzle pieces. They're actually the United States congressional districts of Texas.
You look at them and you're thinking, well, they should all be kind of like somewhat contiguous and square, but then when you see one that kind of looks like a snake or something like that, you're kind of wondering, well, what's the logic behind that?
These shapes are a major factor in determining our representation in the U.S. House of Representatives, which means they play a major role in who's looking out for your best interests in Washington. And the shapes of these districts, they're not random. This map looks this way by design, thanks to a process known as redistricting. In Texas, redistricting is done by our elected state lawmakers.
You have a situation where the politicians are choosing the voters when what we should be seeing is the voters choosing the politicians.
And in Texas, these maps have repeatedly gotten lawmakers in trouble over allegations of giving unfair advantages to certain political parties or voting groups.
It could be that lines are drawn to disadvantage rural voters or disadvantage urban voters. Sometimes lines can be drawn to disadvantage racial minorities.
For those of us who've been advocates for the minority communities, Latino and African American communities, there's a great deal of interest to make sure that those communities are adequately represented in the way the lines are drawn.
In this week's episode of KSAT Explains, we're focusing on redistricting, examining how this once-a-decade process has become so contentious and what will be different about this year.
KSAT Explains.
KSAT Explains. KSAT Explains.
KSAT Explains. On-demand, in-depth perspective. Perspective on stories we bring you in our newscasts throughout the day. We're looking into concerns over voting safety during a pandemic and the battle over mail-in voting. A look at how the protests and demonstrations have played out in our city and an examination of what it means to be black in San Antonio.
An issue that you have likely felt the effects of, rising property taxes.
The roots of Tejano run deep in South Texas. We examine the cultural impact the music has had in San Antonio.
Well, it is a complicated process that will help define our political landscape for the next decade. The Texas legislature will take up the task of redrawing the lines on our state's congressional and legislative maps.
Thanks for joining us for a new episode of KSAT Explains. I'm Myra Arthur. It's not exactly exciting or a topic that a lot of people rush to read about, but it is incredibly important to all of us. Redistricting. It's the time when our elected leaders go from lawmakers to map makers to put you into a group that ultimately determines who represents you at the federal level. By the end of this episode, you'll know how it works and why what ends up on that map isn't always the full picture. So let's start here. What is redistricting? It happens every 10 years, every time a new U.S. Census comes around.
Redistricting has to do with the boundaries that are drawn for our election districts. So anything that we elect by district could be state representatives, state senate, Congress, school board, city council. All of those districts get redrawn every 10 years after the census to make sure that there are roughly the same number of people from district to district, and that creates equality of representation.
Or at least that's the idea. We'll get back to that in just a minute. Redistricting relies heavily on population.
Some states that are not growing as fast as others are going to lose congressional seats, and Texas is going to be the largest gainer. We're going to get 3 new congressional seats by most projections, going from 36 to 39.
As of early February, lawmakers and the rest of us are still waiting to find out America's head count according to the 2020 census. But the U.S. Census Bureau did put out an estimate for the population of Texas as of July 1st, 2020.
29,360,759. And that, if the census count is consistent with that, then that would mean that Texas added about 4,215,000 new residents over the decade.
That would also mean Texas added more people than any other state over the last 10 years, which is why we're expected to get 3 more representatives to speak for Texans in Washington. But state lawmakers need the new census numbers first. And this go-round, the data is delayed.
But the normal process was the census results would be out by January 1st. So this past January 1st, we would have known how many congressional districts Texas was going to have. And then by the middle of February, people would have enough data to really draw the plans. Well, this time, the latest thing I've heard is that we won't get the first results until April or May, and won't get the final information until the summer. So there's probably going to have to be a special session of the legislature to draw the plans.
The holdup is a combination of things. First, the pandemic. That slowed down how quickly census information is usually gathered. Plus, this was the first time the census was done online. That adjustment and a lack of internet access for some people was another factor. Then there was the legal battle sparked by former President Donald Trump not wanting undocumented residents to be counted in the census. Then President Joe Biden took office and said yes, undocumented persons should be counted.
This is in a strange position because if undocumented are not counted, Texas will probably get 1 or 2 fewer congressional seats than would otherwise have. Now, some people would rather lose seats for the state than to have undocumented counted in the various districts, but it's sort of cutting off our nose to spite our face.
And that's just a small part of the controversy that can surround redistricting. And that timeline, it can get pushed back even further if lawsuits are filed to challenge those redrawn maps, which is almost expected these days. So how did this process become so contentious? KSAT Explains producer Lexi Salazar breaks down what's called gerrymandering and where that concept comes from.
Redrawing maps that determine representation in D.C. sounds like a neutral principle, but it's a process that quickly gets heated, and that controversy is nothing new.
It's been around as long as there have been elections.
For years now, political parties in power have drawn district lines to favor their parties. And we can expect the same thing when Texas state legislators get the census results and are tasked with redrawing the congressional map.
What the map makers will be doing, in addition to trying to achieve equally sized congressional districts, is in our state, achieve partisan purposes in order to advantage, in this case, the Republican Party, so that they will gain a larger share of the congressional seats than they might otherwise, according to the distribution of votes.
It's why these maps are filled with seemingly random shapes.
If you look at them and you're thinking, well, they should all be kind of like, somewhat contiguous and square, but then when you see one that kind of looks like a snake or something like that, you're kind of wondering, well, what's the logic behind that?
The logic is trying to align people in terms of politics. It's been going on for years, but with more demographic information at legislators' fingertips, the line drawing has become more methodical.
Historically, it was hard to design a system that would be pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. I mean, there was general understanding of it. But now with the increased data, the decision makers can draw maps that are quite clear as to whether they're going to be pro-Democrat or pro-Republican.
It's called gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering is a term that people came up with to describe when district lines are drawn in a way that somebody considers to be unfair.
Gerrymandering is likely a word you've heard before, probably in a high school government class. The term comes from 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry. Gerry had a long political career. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence and the 5th Vice President of the United States. But he is perhaps best known for signing an infamous redistricting bill. The Democratic Republicans, the party Gerry belonged to, controlled Massachusetts state legislature. Lawmakers drew the state Senate districts to benefit the party. According to the Smithsonian, until then, districts had followed county boundaries. The new Senate map was filled with odd shapes, one that was said to resemble a salamander, and it drew opposition from the Federalist Party. But Gerry signed the redistricting bill in February of 1812. A satirical cartoon featured in the Boston Gazette depicted the districts into a mystical-looking animal dubbed the gerrymander. The term stuck, but at some point people stopped pronouncing the word with a hard G. There's an argument to be made that we should all be saying gerrymandering, but that's for another episode of KSAT Explains. So what exactly does it mean to draw districts in a way that's unfair? How does gerrymandering work? We demonstrate with Tetris.
In an ideal world, I think that we would see congressional districts that attempt to represent communities of interest. And the idea there would be that regions or cities would all be represented by a voice in Congress, But instead, what we frequently see is an effort to either group certain kinds of voters together or divide them.
Those are the two main tactics of gerrymandering: grouping certain kinds of voters together, or packing constituencies, or dividing them, cracking constituencies. Take a look at this. The group of yellow and purple Tetris blocks need to be divided into 4 groups. There are some straightforward ways to divvy them up, like this, or even this, or this. But let's say the yellow party is in power, and they want to dilute the influence of the purples. They could divide the blocks this way, making sure to pack in as many purple blocks into one group as possible, dividing the remaining purples into groups with yellow majorities. Now let's compare the results of the first way of grouping with the more strategic way. And gerrymandering is as effective in theory as it is in practice. Take this prime example. This barbell-looking shape is Congressional District 35, a district that Lloyd Doggett has represented in the U.S. House since 1995. The district links downtown San Antonio with parts of Austin.
The idea there was to concentrate democratically leaning voters into that district, and they achieved it because Lloyd Doggett wins with super majorities, meaning that there are relatively few Republicans in the district, and that allowed them then to more evenly distribute Republican voters in neighboring areas in order to achieve a larger number of wins at smaller margins.
Gerrymandering has been going on in states around the country for years under both major political parties. It's a practice with real consequences.
When you have unfair redistricting, really anybody can be hurt by that. It could be that lines are drawn to disadvantage rural voters or disadvantage urban voters. Sometimes lines can be drawn to disadvantage racial minorities.
A major consequence, a lack of adequate representation in Congress.
We have a growing number of Black and Hispanic representatives from Texas, but non-Hispanic whites now make up about 41% of the population, but the vast majority of the representatives that we send to Washington.
Gerrymandering can also dilute the impact of a community. If a single city is cut up into pieces, and those pieces are combined with pieces from another community to create an entire district. Lloyd Potter is the demographer for the state of Texas. He's been part of redistricting hearings in the state Senate and says this is a complaint he's heard from more than one person.
The idea is that if you have a community that wants to have a politician that's accountable to them and looking out for their interests, and that community is then carved up through this process, they then are not, they may not be getting representation.
And when gerrymandering creates so-called safe districts, districts where one party is overwhelmingly favored in elections, it kills competition.
And there's not really any need to have a debate or discussion about the issues because it doesn't really matter in terms of the outcome of the election.
If you're in a district that's very safe, then you rely on your supporters and you take them for granted, and you can ignore everybody who you don't think is going to vote for you because you know you're going to win anyway. And that's not a good model for representation.
So the question is there a better way to draw the map, one purely based on population and not politics? Some seem to think so. In fact, not all states leave their elected lawmakers with the task of drawing the congressional maps. Colorado, California, and Hawaii are among the states that leave redistricting up to a non-political commission. And state demographer Lloyd Potter believes that theoretically, Texas could do redistricting in a much more mathematic way.
There are actually a number of both political scientists and geographers who have kind of gone through this and developed almost a formulaic way of kind of completely nonpartisan. It's just kind of like, running an algorithm against the data and the geography and, defining districts that way.
But as far as actually making that happen, it doesn't seem likely anytime soon.
Essentially, both parties would have to agree to it, and they'd have to go through a legislative process to define that process. And I just don't see either one of them seeing that as being in their best interest.
So for now, the partisan way the maps are drawn seems to be here to stay. And like in years past, it seems that this go-round will be contentious once again. Every year since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, federal courts have found that Texas lawmakers disenfranchised voters when drawing the maps. RJ Marquez explains our state's history of voter suppression and what will be different this year.
For nearly 5 decades after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Texas was one of several states covered by what's known as preclearance.
Preclearance is a very powerful piece of legislation that said that states like Texas and other states that have histories of racial discrimination basically have to get the permission of the federal government before any changes can be made to election laws.
The idea was that with preclearance in place, there were safeguards against lawmakers drawing maps that would suppress or disenfranchise Hispanics and black voters across the state. But it didn't stop lawmakers from trying. In fact, Texas has not made it through a single decade since preclearance has been required without a federal court ruling saying it violated federal laws.
The legal battle over the 2011 maps lasted nearly to the end of the last decade. While that battle played out, Texas needed interim legislative and congressional maps. A federal court in San Antonio drew up the interim maps for the 2012 elections, and a year later, the state legislature made those maps permanent. But there were challenges for years along the way.
Civil rights experts say one of the reasons lawmakers were racially gerrymandering was to dilute the impact of the booming Latino population in Texas.
Since Texas started redistricting every 10 years in the 1970s, in every single round, the courts or the Justice Department have found that Texas discriminated against Latino voters. That's primarily because in Texas, Latino voters have been a growing population, and Texas has had some hesitancy about creating districts to reflect that growth fairly. But it could also be another racial group that experiences discrimination in redistricting, like African Americans or Asian Americans, which we had examples of discrimination there in the last redistricting round, as well as Latinos.
This year, the landscape of Texas redistricting is expected to shift dramatically because of a landmark decision in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court to strike down preclearance.
When you had preclearance, the maps had to first be at least given a look at by the folks at the Justice Department, and whether it was a Democratic administration in Washington or a Republican administration in Washington.
And 6 years after preclearance was struck down, Texas voting rights groups were dealt another blow. The Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that federal courts were powerless to hear challenges to partisan gerrymandering.
And so for Democrats or anyone who's looking out for minority populations because of gerrymandering, they're going to have to argue in federal court that those maps are racially discriminatory, which can be a difficult thing to prove.
With that decision and no preclearance protection for the first time since 1965, Texas is entering uncharted territory. It's concerning for people fighting voter suppression, and those who are keeping an eye on things say it's setting the stage for another drawn-out battle in the courts.
To not have those protections on the front end means that those Democrats in the legislature and those representing minority communities in the legislature, which of course would be disproportionately would be Democrats, they have to do their due diligence on the front end in the legislative process, and they can't depend on Washington anymore on the front end of this.
We still don't have those census results yet, and we don't exactly know when the redistricting process will actually begin. But the experts we talked to in this show encourage you to pay attention. And if you'd like to take part in a virtual town hall focusing on all regions of Texas, that is happening on February 27th. We have a link to information on how you can submit a public comment and watch that hearing. It's all in the article for this episode on KSAT.com/explains. Thanks for joining us for our show. We'll see you right back here next week.